a cloud that shows no sign of lifting for this president just days after Donald Trump claimed total exoneration in the Mueller probe, a blow for the president in public opinion. A new poll shows that a majority of Americans, 56%, believe Donald Trump is not exonerated of collusion. And news today that the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is back on Capitol Hill, meeting with the Senate Intel Committee as part of its Russia investigation. And the big news today about the actual Mueller report, which no one outside of the Barr Justice Department has seen, is that it is at least 300 pages long. The New York Times today reporting, quote, the total of 300 plus pages suggests that Mr. Mueller went well beyond the kind of bare-bones summary required by the Justice Department regulation governing his appointment and detailed his conclusions at length. And it raises questions about what Mr. Barr might have left out of the 4 dense pages he sent to Congress. This news comes as Adam Schiff, top Democrat on the House Intel Committee, presses on with his investigation into whether the president has been compromised by Russia, despite an orchestrated smear campaign from the White House and congressional Republicans. Trump tweeting this morning that Schiff should be forced to resign from Congress. And just hours later, Trump's loyal soldiers in the Republican Party called for Schiff's resignation at a public committee hearing. Schiff responded defiantly and forcefully, reminding his Republican colleagues why his persistence matters.
My colleagues may think it's okay that the Russians offered dirt on a Democratic candidate for president as part of what was described as the Russian government's effort to help the Trump campaign. You might think that's okay. My colleagues might think it's okay that when that was offered to the son of the president, who had a pivotal role in the campaign, that the president's son did not call the FBI. He did not adamantly refuse that foreign help. No, instead, that son said that he would love the help of the Russians. You might think it's okay that he took that meeting. You might think it's okay that Paul Manafort, the campaign chair, someone with great experience in running campaigns, also took that meeting. You might think it's okay that the president's son-in-law also took that meeting. You might think it's okay that they concealed it from the public. You might think it's okay that their only disappointment after that meeting was that the dirt they received on Hillary Clinton wasn't better. You might think that's okay. You might think it's okay that when it was discovered a year later that they lied about that meeting and said it was about adoptions. You might think it's okay that the president is reported to have helped dictate that lie. You might think that's okay. I don't. I think it's immoral. I think it's unethical. I think it's unpatriotic. And yes, I think it's corrupt and evidence of collusion. Now, I have always said that the question of whether this amounts to proof of conspiracy was another matter. Whether the special counsel could prove beyond a reasonable doubt the proof of that crime would be up to the special counsel, and I would accept his decision, and I do. He's a good and honorable man, and he is a good prosecutor. But I do not think that conduct, criminal or not, is okay. And the day we do think that's okay is the day we will look back and say that is the day America lost its way.
Powerful, forceful words, reminders for all of us that while the special counsel was examining and looking for crimes, the special counsel appointed to investigate and prosecute crimes, abnormal behavior is all around us. That was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee today, and that is where we start with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Reporting from outside the Department of Justice, Julia Ainsley, NBC News national security and justice reporter. Former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Elliot Williams is back. Washington Post national political reporter and MSNBC political analyst Robert Costa. With us on set, White House reporter for the LA Times, Eli Stokols, and Mimi Rocah, a former Assistant U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst. Mimi, it's so important and it's so funny how the roles have swapped back and forth. I'm old enough to remember in this story when it was Rudy Giuliani screaming at the top of his lungs, collusion isn't a crime. Now you've got Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump saying he's cleared of collusion. Collusion wasn't a crime. Conspiracy, a criminal intentional conspiracy, was not proven, wasn't established, I think is the word the special counsel used. But all that conduct is undeniable. All that conduct we should expect to be detailed in pretty devastating anecdotal and perhaps narrative in the actual Mueller report when we see it. Nothing that Adam Schiff said was something that Trump was cleared of.
Exactly. I mean, that's a great point about Giuliani. You know, look, one thing has been taken off the table by what we know so far by Barr's summary of the Mueller report. And that is, as Adam Schiff said, as you said, it is the charging of a criminal conspiracy against Trump and people in his campaign about a very specific thing, election interference with the Russian government. There's still a lot on the table. That takes one thing off the table, an important thing, and something that, yes, people should accept. I think once we see it from Mueller, but we should accept, of course, and that's a good thing. But it leaves on the table all of this conduct that needs to be explained, conduct that Congressman Schiff did a great job of marshaling. And it shows us why it's so important for us to see the Mueller report, because what he was doing is marshaling the evidence. That's what prosecutors do. They investigate and then they lay it out in a way that makes it more comprehensible. Even if there's no argument or conclusions drawn, just seeing it in a form and somebody like Robert Mueller, who is so experienced and has so much sort of context to put it in, to marshal it together, summarize it in the way that he obviously did in a very detailed report, that will be invaluable for how we understand this, what happened. And it shows, again, why it's so important for us to see the report.
Julie Ainsley, the Justice Department going a little farther today than they had so far this week in confirming, at least for news organizations, that the report is at least 300 pages long. I'm told by a source familiar with the investigation and the final product that a lot of that will not, that this story is as good as it's going to get for Donald Trump right now, with the 3.5-page summary being all that we know of Mueller's 2-year-long work.
Yeah, I mean, that very well could be, because what we expect to be in that document, which is over 300 pages, is more evidence. The evidence that the Attorney General had over the weekend as he decided to write that report and that letter that he sent to Congress. And one of the things that Barr says in there is that there is evidence on both sides of the obstruction case. And Robert Mueller laid out enough evidence to explain this thing that none of us can understand. Jim Comey said he can't understand it. And that's why he essentially left it as a jump ball over the issue of obstruction. So the amount of information that someone like Robert Mueller would include in that, we assume to be voluminous. We've heard that word used before. And now we know it's over 300 pages, and even could be, we know it's somewhere over 300 and less than 1,000 based on reporting from the Washington Post. So that's a large range. I've tried to get that narrowed down multiple times today, Nicole. I've had a hard time getting it narrowed down. But not only does it show that Robert Mueller went above the call of that bare bones report that he was required to send here to the Justice Department, but it also might reignite calls to see more transparency in this report. We know it's going to leave out grand jury information and will leave out evidence that could be used in further investigations and further criminal proceedings that might spin off of this. But I think now that we know that there's so much more in there that explains what is so far unexplainable, the calls to see more of this report are just going to get louder.
Let me follow up with you, Julia, and ask you about this evidence on both sides. I understand that the evidence on the side of not calling it a crime is really very much steeped in the law, that their understanding and analysis of the law was that the Article 2 authorities gave the president a lot of running room, but that the evidence, that what we may very well see is conduct that will be clear to anyone that looks at it as pretty damning.
Right. Well, one of the things that Barr says is that he did not consider the Justice Department opinion of whether or not you can indict a sitting president, but he doesn't say whether or not Mueller considered that. And you would think that he would rule that out if it had in fact been ruled out, because they wanted to explain that decision. And so it could be that Robert Mueller had evidence of obstruction, but knew how high that bar would be because of that opinion not to indict a sitting president. And therefore, he left it up to Barr. And the thing that Barr included was the fact that he couldn't prove intent because there was no underlying crime. And I saw Jim Comey speak earlier this week, the person who started this whole investigation in the first place, and he said that it is not the Justice Department tradition to believe that you can't charge obstruction without an underlying crime. And I know Mimi and many others can speak to that the very essence of that really would make the obstruction statute obsolete, because what if you could obstruct an investigation to the point that you can't prove the underlying crime?
Yeah, Elliot, let me drill down on that exact point with you. Obstruction of justice exists as a separate set of crimes for the very reason that if you could never charge obstruction without the underlying crime, everybody would obstruct an investigation into themselves or their company or their campaign or their administration. Is that right?
Right. The intent has to be there to impede the administration of justice. So absolutely, you may not be able to find the underlying crime, but an individual can be trying to impede the administration of justice. And once again, Mimi is spot on. There is evidence of obstruction. He has said to the president of the United States, said in the Lester Holt interview that he intended to get rid of Jim Comey, to get rid of the, quote unquote, this Russia thing was the language he used. Now, that may not have risen to the level to convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt under the federal criminal obstruction statute, but he's clearly trying to stop an investigation, and that should be abundantly clear to everyone. The fact that this is a 300-page report detailing all of the evidence into the president is evidence of the fact that they uncovered evidence, that they uncovered information about this. The fact that they spent, even in this 4 pages, the obstruction section is incredibly instructive in terms of how Barr talks about reasonable doubt as a hard standard to meet, and the president is not exonerated. It is abundantly clear to me, I think it's abundantly clear to many people that when you look at it, there's evidence there. Now, again, could you convict an individual of a crime? That's an open question, or at least Barr and the special counsel have found so. But the bigger question is, for people in the public trust, what's the standard? And I think the standard for is it a crime or is it not can't be where the conversation ends. When we're talking about the president of the United States, we have to have a different standard than, well, he didn't commit a crime, so it's all fine, throw our hands up and call it a day. It just, we demand more as a populace from our elected officials. And so there you go. It's a little disconcerting to see that, because of the fact that there's been a finding, or at least a 4-page summary of a finding, that because there was no chargeable crime, that the conversation should end with respect to the president. But that just can't be it. On obstruction. And
Robert Costa, that won't be it. The Mueller report, the politics in that town better than I do, but all of the crush of the political energy on both sides of the aisle, as long as the Republicans are claiming some sort of exoneration and Democrats want more information because of Mueller's, what everyone's been talking about, Mueller's refusal to either exonerate or charge, it seems that the political pressure will be on releasing this report. It would appear that the strategy at this point from the president's allies would be to get themselves somehow an offense. But if they think they've been exonerated, why do they need to keep the war going against the rule of law and their perceived enemies in Congress?
There's a fear among many of my Republican sources about the obstruction side of Robert Mueller's report. They're unsure of what's in there, different actions that have not been reported publicly, and they're not really ready to move on because they know those reports could be brought up at any time. Should this report be leaked? Should it get in the hands of Congress? Should Mr. Mueller or the Attorney General be called to testify? So Republicans are bracing for different kinds of questions of the president's conduct to come up in the coming weeks, even as they feel a little better about the aspect of Russian interference and conspiracy within the Trump campaign.
All right, you have all invoked this man, Jim Comey. Let me play his interview, some of his interview with Lester Holt last night. We'll talk about it on the other side.
Close your eyes. Again, change the names. Let me make one up for you. The Iranians, this is totally made up, the Iranians interfere in the election to help elect Barack Obama because they think they'll get a better nuclear deal from him. And during that election, an Obama aide meets with the Iranians and talks about the dirt they have that will help Obama get elected. And the FBI finds out about that. We should not investigate that? And then President Obama's national security advisor lies to the FBI about his contacts with the Iranians. And then the president, Obama, asked me to drop an investigation of that and then fires me and says, I was thinking of the Iranian thing. And then he invites the mullahs to the Oval Office and tells them that FBI director was a real nut job. I lifted a lot of pressure by firing him. Who on earth doesn't think the FBI should investigate that? So the hypocrisy is revealed just by changing the names. The FBI did what it absolutely had to do. The American people should be glad it's there and proud of it, and the rest is just lying and noise.
He makes a great point, because sitting here, and you know Trump tells, you know this White House, you cover this president, he would do that and more. Devin Nunes would, streak across the Capitol to get the attention of everybody under the sun to do exactly what Jim Comey just detailed.
Right, and it's an interesting and smart point that he makes, but as we all know, this White House and this president, the ethics are situational at best. There's not a lot of consistency, and they don't care about people pointing out the discrepancies or the hypocrisies. And they certainly, Bob is right that there are Republicans and there are people at the White House who are concerned about the details that are going to eventually come out, especially pertaining to the obstruction side of this. But I was at the White House just a day or two ago, and it's like being in the locker room of a team after they win a football game in overtime. They are jubilant. The president, I'm told, is also jubilant. I think we know that because he took a break from tweeting for much of the weekend. So you could tell something wasn't eating at him after he had some pressure relieved. But inside the White House, they had printed out on a paper the headlines from 4 major newspapers on Monday, all saying no collusion, Mueller, no collusion. Mm-hmm. The headline, they think that top line is enough. And at least politically, that's the sense. Yes, they're concerned. They know there are other details in there that are not good, but by and large, they feel satisfied that top line, the headline, that is what people are going to take away. That the public that's not going to read through hundreds of pages and isn't all that plugged in, it already kind of has their mind made up on these things. The polling reflects that, and they just think that this is enough for them to go out and oversell, total exoneration, right, to go completely on offense and try to bully Adam Schiff and the Democrats, because there is a presidential election coming up, and they're aware of the delicate nature of this for Democrats also, who don't want to come across as only out to get the president, having nothing else to offer. I think that's why you've seen the reluctance from Speaker Pelosi to go full bore into impeachment proceedings, and they've tried to, at least at the leadership level, be judicious. Donald Trump is going to be out there. He's going to be out there tonight in Michigan railing about, Democrats, a witch hunt. He's going to keep this up, and they feel like that headline from the Barr letter is enough to give them fresh ammo to do that.
Robert Costa, I see 2 problems with that analysis. One, it's not bearing out in the polls yet. I was actually surprised to see the CNN poll today. It's been five news cycles. They've had Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Today's Thursday. 56% of Americans don't believe the president has been cleared of collusion, despite that no collusion headline being on all those newspapers. That surprised me. This was not a light switch that the White House could simply turn on and activate and really reach beyond their 43%, 45% of their base. More than that doesn't believe them. More than that was convinced through 2 years of seeing Jim Comey and Adam Schiff and others point out simply the mysterious contacts. And I think people talked for a long time about low-tech crimes. Possibility that even if there wasn't a criminal conspiracy, there was enough unseemly conduct to have done the harm that this investigation was going to do. Is that reality setting in there?
The reality is setting in among Republicans in the sense that they know the president's conduct, even if not deemed legally a conspiracy by Robert Mueller based on the Attorney General's summary. We have not seen the full report. Even though he's in the legal clear based on the Attorney General's summary, he could not be in the political clear, because if you take that Trump Tower Moscow meeting, for example, you have questions of judgment, perhaps of conspiracy in the eyes of many Democrats who do see a corrupt intent in that meeting to acquire information about Secretary Clinton, to use foreign powers to try to influence an election. But Republicans at the least see bad judgment in that meeting, and they see bad judgment in other decisions that were made during this campaign and by this president. The question they have is this all noise to most voters, or are voters truly engaged, paying attention to these data points and amassing a judgment on this presidency that could become a reckoning in 2020?
For you, Robert Costa, and you, Julia, what do we know about Jared Kushner's trip to Capitol Hill? Because as much as they're willing to forgive the president all this bad judgment, I understand a lot of people running out of patience. Someone said to me, he's one scandal away from being someone we wish the president would cut loose. Robert, you first, and then you, Julia.
We've heard that about Mr. Kushner for 2 years now. He remains the president's confidant because he's married to Ms. Trump, and he is a close advisor to the president. But his security clearances do alarm many Republicans. His financial disclosure reports have alarmed many Republicans. But he's been able to survive. He worked on criminal justice reform and other issues, and he plows forward nonetheless.
Julia, do we know anything about his trip to Capitol Hill today to meet with senators on the Senate Intel Committee about their Russia investigation?
Well, you know, it was closed door, Nicole, and they don't call people in often on that committee. And so it could be more significant than we know. But so far, we were only able, or our colleagues on Capitol Hill were only able to get a peek of him. But it's certainly raised a lot of questions, especially coming off that recent news that Robert mentions about the security clearances. Is there something more here? But I do think that this White House is more confident as they deal with Congress, as they deal with any inquiries after in this kind of post-Mueller report world, or what they're considering a post-Mueller report worldwide. The rest of us still have some more questions about it.
And just to be technically accurate, it is still a pre-Mueller report world for them, too. They haven't seen it as far as we know.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.